before you hit production. So we'll get right into it, shall we? Hopefully this thing works. Yeah, great. So who am I? I'll just cover off very quickly who the heck I am. So my name is Hamish. The photo in this picture might give you a bit of an idea about where I've come from. For those of you who are a little more discerning in the audience might realize that my accent is from somewhere a little further east. There will be bonus points at the end for if you can work out what the heck this means. So I'm a senior performance engineer. I work for a consultancy down under called JDS Australia. I'm also the lead of our AppDynamics practice as well. So we are elite partners of AppDynamics. In fact, just yesterday we were very lucky enough to pick up the Partner of the Year award for emerging markets. So very pleased with that. And so what our day-to-day jobs are to work with people such as yourself to really help you make sure that your customer experiences are great. So we work with AppDynamics as our APM tool of choice, as well as other areas like IT service management, performance testing, a few other things. So why are we all here in Vegas? Anyone here for the great party tonight? Anyone looking forward to that? Yeah, a few of you? Good, honest, like it. Hopefully there might be a few of you in the audience that are here to make your apps work great. How many of you would like to do that? Yeah, a few of you? Awesome. And ultimately, hopefully some of you are also here to deliver a great customer experience. Anyone here for that? Awesome. Well, we are AppSphere, so hopefully a few of you are here to do something like that. There we go. So I apologize for those of you who are a little more technical in the audience. I do have to give you a couple of slides on why this is important so that when you do go back to your managers and ask for more licenses for this stuff, you've got a few tips to put in your business case. So customer experience and what is it? So this is a fairly, shall I say, fuzzy kind of area. It's going to mean something a little bit different to each of you. But I've got a few things here that I like to talk about when I'm talking about customer experience and what does that actually mean. So the first thing here is, was it fast? Was it efficient enough? Could someone get on your application, get on your site, whatever it is, and get through the thing that needed to do in a reasonable amount of time? Was it easy? Was it easy for them to get on? Did you make it really hard? Could they get something done easy enough? And here's the fuzzy bit. How did we leave the customer feeling? When they got through that site, when they got through the process, whatever they're doing, did they feel good about it? Are they going to come back? Did you leave them with a good time, or did they have not such a good time? Did you leave them feeling frustrated? And of course, the difficulty in all this is it's going to be very relative for every single person. So it's going to be relative to their expectations. What do they expect from you? What were their past experience? Did they have a good time before and now you give them a bad time? Or did they have a bad time before and now you've suddenly given them a good time? These can all have an impact on what they might think of their experience. And of course, it's going to be relative to your competitors. Does your competitor give them a good time versus you? It's going to have an impact. So why does this actually matter? A few more stats to put in that business case for you when you go back. We heard a lot about this yesterday. So if you provide a good experience, your customers are likely to come back and spend more with you. That's probably fairly intuitive to most of you. In fact, there's some stats show something like 140% more they'll spend with you. So that's pretty compelling to give them a good experience. Like we heard yesterday, actually the more recent stat of this is the top 2,000 companies in the world. It's going to cost them about $2.5 billion per year in lost revenue or lost time on their people spending time fixing poor experiences, outages, and such like that. So it can cost you really big money if you're delivering a poor experience. And finally, like a few of you said just before, hopefully there's some of you in the audience that would actually like to deliver a really great experience. Some of us would like to take a bit of pride in our apps, make them great, have our customers have a good time. So, AppDynamics. Obviously, AppDynamics is really great. This gives us a lot of really good tools to help us understand the customer experience and make it really great. So hopefully by now, being we're at AppSphere, you've heard quite a bit about this, so I'll just cover this very, very briefly. So it lets us do things like understand business transactions. We can understand in terms of what your users are really doing, what that experience is, right end to end all the way from your mobile apps and web apps all the way through your architecture. We can do things like tag and trace across the architecture. We can see all the different tiers. We can understand where performance is. We can do deep dive diagnostics. This is very important for geeks like me in that we can get right down into that code level, into the SQL query level, and understand why performance is slow, where the bottleneck is, what's going on right there. And of course, it's all on one pane of glass. So hopefully, you put your hands up. All of you get this. How many of you are actually using AppDynamics already or have seen it in the demos? Yeah, awesome. So you're probably going to get all of this. So that stuff's really great. So why not do this sooner? There's a lot of talk. We can put AppDynamics into production, and it's really great there. We can understand in real time what our customers are really experiencing. So that's pretty awesome. But why not do this sooner? Why wait until we're in production before we understand that? What if we could see all of this a bit sooner? What if we could make that customer experience a really good one before our customers ever come anywhere near our code? So that is what I'm here to talk to you about today. So I'm going to cover off a few things. I have a few goals of what we want to achieve by using AppDynamics in our non-production environments. And I'm going to talk through a few different scenarios of different types of testing and things, some of the benefits of using AppDynamics in those situations, and a whole bunch of tips, things you can actually do for those that are a bit more technical in the audience as to how you can actually make better use of AppDynamics while you're doing those things. So there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff in here. Don't worry about taking notes. It is being recorded. Feel free to have a look afterwards online if you want to implement some of these things yourselves. But for now, let's start talking about it. So a few goals. These are a few goals that are overarching for using AppDynamics in your non-production environments. So the first thing, like I mentioned, we really want to understand and be able to tune and optimize the customer experience as soon as we possibly can. If we're waiting till we're in production, that's possibly too late. Your customers are probably already hitting that code. So what if we could do that sooner? What if we could make sure the customer experience is great before your customers ever touch it? Something else we want to achieve is that we want to make sure that we have continual feedback for your designers, for your developers, so that when you're doing testing, when you're doing development, there's a continual feedback loop so that they're getting back information about how their code is performing and make sure they can do something about it right then and there rather than waiting until later on. And of course, again, for some of the managers in the room, we really want to help you to maximize your investment in AppDynamics. You probably spent a bunch of money getting a pretty awesome tool set up, and so there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do to make sure you're using that to the full extent that you could. All right, and of course, AppDynamics makes this pretty easy for us. So there's a couple of things that we can do. There's a couple of things that they do to make this easy for you. So of course, one of the big things, and we heard a bit about this yesterday in the keynote about this, has actually just got a whole lot easier with the universal agent, that it's super easy and fast to install. Like for me, working with clients, we can literally have AppDynamics up and running within a couple of hours across a bunch of their apps. So that's very powerful. If they're struggling to find performance issues and things, we can go in there and very quickly have this up and running. Something that some of you may or may not realize is that usually with AppDynamics, if you're going to use it in a non-production environment, you'll actually get discounted licenses to use that. So there's obviously a price for production. If you're going to use it in your non-production environments, you can actually get licenses for a bit cheaper as well. So it helps you get a bit more value out of what you're spending. And of course, with everything AppDynamics, you got to get all the stuff that I'm going to talk about, all these features, all these great things. And of course, they're in that single pane of glass. How many of you can imagine how many different tools your developers and testers and people have to use? It's probably a ton, right? So with AppDynamics, you're going to get a whole lot of stuff in one place. So that's really great. All right, so I'm going to talk through a few different scenarios here of the things that you might be doing and how you might use AppDynamics with them. And so each of these are going to be a set of features or goals that we want from each of them, and then a few tech tips about what you can actually do to improve integration and things. So I'll talk about development a little bit first. And so development is the first place that usually we can see our code performance. So it's the first place where your developers are actually writing their code. They're probably going to be running back unit tests and things like that. And so if we could use AppDynamics there, we could have those developers understand how that code is performing, how those queries are performing right away. We don't have to wait until they're actually doing testing or even worse, in production. And so what this allows us to do is we can optimize at development time. Imagine if your developers could see straight away, oh, here's how my code performs, here's how that system talks to that system, and fix that right then and there rather than waiting until several weeks later when there's something gone wrong. Another thing we want to do here, a challenge we have sometimes with some applications is that they require some effort to do the instrumentation of AppDynamics. If you've got some custom applications where the out-of-the-box instrumentation hasn't worked. Usually this involves developer effort to work out the classes and methods where we need to instrument there. So if we can have developers looking at this really early on, then they can take care of that for us. You don't have to pay expensive consultants like me to come in and tell you how to do that later on. Do myself out of business there. That's not good. And also finally it's really useful to have your developers familiar with AppDynamics really early on, so that when you are looking at issues that are occurring in production or later environments, that they already know how to use the tool, they know what snapshots are, they know how to do the diagnosis, they know how to navigate the tool. So the earlier you can have them on board with that, the more you're going to get out of it. So a couple of things in development here that you can do. This is for the techies in the audience. So it's pretty simple to put an agent into your app. This is a screenshot from, this is IntelliJ. I'm a bit of a Java monkey, so Java's the thing that I'm most familiar with. And so it's pretty easy just by putting a couple of command lines in the JVM options there. You can add an agent in, and your developer can use that straight away. And like I said, what they can then do is they can make sure those business transactions are instrumented correctly. So because this is the first place where they're running their code, they can make sure that AppDynamics is picking up those business transactions, making sure it's gathering all the right information early on. And another thing that might help you here is that with AppDynamics, with all the microservices focus, there are licenses that are available for for applications with small memory footprints. So it's another thing that might help you get a bit more out of your licensing by using the microservices licenses with your developers. Because chances are they're not going to be running the full-blown, massive big JVMs and things. So they might be able to get away with using microservices licenses, which will save you a bit of money as well. So the next bit here. So functional testing, systems integration testing, user acceptance testing. So typically, this is the first place where real humans will exercise your full app. So in your UAT environment, for example, this is probably the first place where you've got everything set up and you're going to have real people, probably your testing staff, come in and use your app. And it's also probably going to be the first place where your full architecture is integrated. So you're going to have all the different components, talking to downstream components, other applications. This is really the first place where we get that full picture of what your whole application is, and we can see all of that in AppDynamics. So what this really allows us to do is we can get an idea of what our real customer experience is going to be. So you're going to have people using your app, you're going to have them in the browser or on the mobile app, whatever it is, actually exercising the different transactions. And so we can know right then and there what's it going to be like. We don't have to wait until we've got real users in there. There we go. And another great thing about this is that if your testers are coming across issues, if they're finding bugs, if they're encountering errors, they might not have such a great tool to capture really rich information about that. So when they're filing bug reports, when they're logging tickets in Jira or whatever tool you're using, they can do things like capture the snapshot data, capture which line of code it was that caused that error, which line of code it was that caused that slowness, what the SQL statement was, what the test data was. So you can get your developers very quickly right down to the exact line of code that they need to be looking at to resolve that bug. So it saves you a whole lot of time in triage and diagnosis there. So again, for the technical people in the audience, a few tips here. So something I do with my clients when doing this kind of thing is that I will inject a header into requests using the test tool. So this is a screenshot from JMeter, but a lot of test tools, if you're doing automation or using tools like Selenium and such to do this, will allow you to put in a header. And what I do here is I'll put the test case name right in that header. And what this allows us to do is that AppDynamics can pick that up, and we can use that in either our business transaction names or in the snapshots that we're collecting. And what that means is that as your testers are running through different test cases, different business processes, in AppDynamics, that all of the stats and the metrics are going to align right with those things. So if you need to go into AppDynamics and find out, well, I want to know all the tests that have been run for my load homepage there and get the stats for that, then you can search for it straight away. So that's super useful. Another thing that we would often do in a test or development environment is a couple of features in AppDynamics that you might not have seen that will help you with this. So the first one is the development mode. Now just to caveat this, just be very careful with this. This is definitely not for production. And in fact, there are built-in limits that will stop you from using this if there is too much load. But what development mode allows you to do is that as you've got users coming into your system doing testing, it means that it will capture snapshots for every single request, up to some built-in limits to protect you from having performance impact. So typically in a test environment, you've probably only got maybe a handful of users at one time using that. So the load's not going to be very high. So by default, you're not going to capture too much in the way of snapshots. Performance is probably going to be okay. So using this allows you to capture that rich information for every single request that those testers are doing. And another thing there, if you don't want to capture it for everything, there's actually a little trick you can do using your test tool. There's a header called AppDynamics Snapshot Enabled. Feel free to come and ask me afterwards if you want to note that down. If you add in that header and set it to true, that will trigger a snapshot in AppDynamics. So if you just want a particular user or a particular request to trigger that capture of deep dive information, you can actually use that header to selectively do that. So that's a little trick that I've used to get rich information on demand. Now, there's another tool within AppDynamics that a lot of people don't realize. It's a little bit hidden under one of the menus. There's a release comparison tool. And it seems pretty simple, but this is actually very important for a lot of our clients to understand how performance is changing as they do things in their environments. So what the release comparison tool allows you to do is you basically just select 2 time periods, and you could have saved time periods for certain releases or certain versions. And you can compare any of the metrics right alongside each other across your application. So pretty simple, but this allows us to really understand when we did that deployment, how did performance change? Or when we made that configuration change, how did it change? So we can get an idea very quickly as to did we make an improvement or not. One more thing, so in AppDynamics, by default, those snapshots that we're capturing, the snapshots with the call graphs and the deep dive information, they're only going to be kept for 2 weeks. And that is configurable, but the maximum you can have is only 5 weeks. So for some of you, that might not be long enough. So there's actually a little trick you can do, just right within the snapshot screen there's actually a little button under Actions called Archive. And so if you've captured some of this information and you're feeding that back into your Jira tickets and such, if you hit that Archive button there, it's going to keep it around. It's not going to delete it until you actually go in and delete it. So that can be something that's quite important if you're sharing these snapshots around, make sure it sticks around. All right. So another situation here. So if you're doing continuous build, and I'm only going to cover this very briefly. There are a few other sessions, hopefully some of you have seen them, about people doing CI/CD, constant deployments. But a couple of tips here. So of course, with AppDynamics, everything gets baselined, right? We've heard about baselines and all the IQ around that. And so something that's really useful to do is actually have a baseline that's aligned to your release period. I'll show you in just a second a little screenshot of how you do that. But if you can have a baseline that says, here's what my previous release was like, then you can know straight away if once you've deployed that new version, is it matching, is there any regressions, is it matching performance? I think this thing needs batteries. So what it allows us to do is we can know very quickly if your experience is degraded. If you're doing continuous build, you want to know right away, has something gone wrong? Is there some kind of regression? The guys yesterday in the keynote were talking about those micro-regressions, the Carphone warehouse people. So this is exactly what they're talking about. We can know straight away, has something even right down to a tiny little detail in some little call or some little line of code, has that degraded? So that's super important. Another thing we want to do with this is that we really need to make sure that our monitoring is keeping up with our builds. So if you're adding new features, you're adding new pages, you're adding new services, you want to make sure that AppDynamics is picking those up and monitoring them. You don't want to miss out on important business transactions. So if we're using continuous build, something we want to do is make sure our monitoring is keeping up there. So if we're using this in those earlier environments, we can ensure that's happening before we hit production. And of course, if you're doing CI/CD, there's probably a good chance you're making use of microservices or containers and those kind of things. So as I'm sure you've heard, AppDynamics has a lot of support for that, including those licensing options. So make use of that. So another thing that we suggest for people doing continuous build, and this is something that some of you may not have come across yet, it's a reasonably new part of the product, is synthetics. So what synthetics allow us to do is we can record a certain business process. So perhaps a user logging in, doing something with the site, and then we can use that to create some low level of load in your environments, even if it's in non-production. So perhaps in a staging environment, in a test environment, you can make sure that even if you don't have users in there all the time, that there's something in there generating some load. So you understand, is that experience still good or is it not? And like I mentioned before, setting baselines there, so there's a little screenshot of how you might do that, how to configure that. So say if you had a 7-day release cycle or something like that, you can actually just go right in and create a baseline that says, tell me the performance of the last 7 days, and then all of your alerting, all of your dashboards are going to show you immediately if your performance has deviated from that. So that's super useful. All right, performance and load testing. So at the start I mentioned that I'm one of our performance engineers, so you'll see that this bit is the bit that excites me just a little bit more. So my day job is basically in doing AppDynamics work and doing performance testing work. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in here that's a little more interesting to me. So with performance testing, typically we're doing that in an environment that's closest to production. So typically we would want to set up an environment that's got the same kind of capacity, it's going to have the same kind of resources, and it's probably going to have the version of code in it that's going to be closest to what's going to go into production, or at least the latest. So that really helps us to understand, in a production-like environment, what things are going to look like. A key thing I do here, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about this in a second, is real-time dashboards during tests. And that might sound pretty trivial, but it's actually super, super powerful and gives us a lot more information compared to what our test tools might give us. And so what we can do here, we can find bottlenecks very quickly. So typically, before AppDynamics came along, when doing performance testing, I would go in, I would run a test. It's probably going to take an hour or two to generate load and ramp it back down again. And then we'd start the process of figuring out, well, why did that transaction go slow? What happened there? It would take us hours, possibly days to troll through logs, talk to different developers, understand from basic metrics like CPU and memory, did something go wrong on that system? Did something go wrong on that system? So something AppDynamics allows us to do is we can know pretty much straight away at least where the bottleneck was occurring, if not right down to, well, here's the line of code that caused that bottleneck. So for me, this means where before I'd be running a couple of tests a week, now I can be running tests multiple times a day. If I find issues, I'm resolving them really quickly. There was one experience I had recently with it was a customer that was using an API gateway product. So they had a bunch of internal services, and they were using this product to expose these services to an external party. And for them, if it wasn't for AppDynamics, they would have just been doing testing, and the performance, it seemed to be okay for them from a user perspective. A few hundred milliseconds for some of the requests seemed okay. But when we put AppDynamics in, we saw that some of the requests, even for a very trivial transaction that should have taken a few milliseconds, were actually taking hundreds of milliseconds. So just by having AppDynamics in there, we could see that something's not right there. And then, of course, had we not had AppDynamics, it would have taken us a long amount of time to figure out what was going on there. But we could see right away in a snapshot, there was a line of code that was just doing hundreds and hundreds of SQL calls unnecessarily. And so we can know straight away that that's a problem. We raised the bug with the vendor, and they fixed it. So that was super powerful. And finally, again, something we can do in a performance test environment when we're running load tests is we can really validate that the AppDynamics instrumentation and all of our health rules, all of our baselines, all of our business transactions, they're all up and good and set correctly, instrumented correctly, and ready to go so that it goes into production. So you can know that on day one, when your code goes into prod, you know that AppDynamics is going to be keeping up with it. You know it's going to have everything ready to go to alert you straight away. So it's actually super important to make sure that you can know straight away rather than waiting until, we put new code in, now we need to go make sure our business transactions and things are okay. So if we can do that sooner, that's really awesome. So again, a few technical tips here for some of you in the crowd. It's the things that I'll do during a performance test when I'm using AppDynamics. So similar to like I mentioned before, we have the ability to put in some headers, and this will help us align what our performance test tool is doing and what AppDynamics is doing. And in fact, some test tools will actually have a tick box that just lets you do this automatically. So it's pretty awesome. But if not, you can do it yourself. So this is, again, just a screenshot from JMeter there. So there's a couple of things I do. So first I'll insert that transaction name, like a test case name, into the header. So what that means is that in my AppDynamics screen, when I've got dashboards and seeing my business transactions, it's going to match up exactly with what my test tool is saying. So my test tool is going to tell me what the average response time is for the login, for loading the homepage, for adding to cart. So AppDynamics is going to tell me that exact same information. So they're going to align very easily so I can match up when I'm doing analysis. Another thing I do is I will insert a unique ID into each request as well as into each iteration. So in load testing, an iteration is where it's one execution of a business process. So in a test, we'll do multiple iterations in a loop. So what this allows us to do is that if you've noticed in your test tool that something went wrong, there was some slowness or a transaction had an error, something like that, If we're capturing an ID, what that allows us to do is go straight into AppDynamics and search for that ID, and we can bring up all those snapshots, all the information relevant to that exact request or that exact iteration, or indeed that exact transaction. So if I'm trying to figure out what the heck's going on here, I can go straight into AppDynamics and go straight to the request that I'm looking at. So that makes my life a whole lot easier. Now, another thing I like to do is create dashboards for each tier. So this may sound pretty simple, but it's actually super helpful. So what I'll do, the first thing I'll do if I'm setting up AppDynamics for a customer and we're going to be doing load testing is create a dashboard that shows the performance and the average response time and error rates and slow call rates of all the different tiers in the architecture. And this is really getting back to helping us to find where slowness is occurring very, very quickly. So like I said before, with a test tool, I'm just going to get the average response time, right? It's not going to tell me where that slowness was. Whereas I have something like this, not only can I tell afterwards, but I can tell right away during a test exactly where that slowness is going. So a recent example was I had a customer where I was doing some load testing, and they had an ESB, right? And they had multiple nodes of this ESB, and they had a few downstream services. And these ESBs were notorious for running out of disk space. The log space would just fill up quickly. Someone would be in there, unbeknownst to me, configuring something, and suddenly logs would blow out. And so something like this would tell me right away during a test exactly which tier and exactly which node had a problem. And so I could fix that straight away. I didn't have to wait till my test is finished, look at the results, understand what they said, oh, there's something wrong, go and talk to 10 different people to figure out what went wrong. I can know right away from one dashboard exactly which tier, exactly which node, exactly which business transaction is performing poorly. And if I need to, I can stop the test, fix it, and start again. So it saves me a heck of a lot of time doing this. Now, something else in AppDynamics you may not be aware of. So the data that's stored, well, it does keep all the data for a year by default. The 1 minute data, so the data that's at a 1 minute resolution is actually only kept for 4 hours out of the box. So if you're running a test that takes a number of hours, you might want to look at that. Likewise, the 10 minute data, which is the next roll up, is only kept for 24 hours. So if you want to do deeper diagnosis like the day after, then you might need to look at these. Just to note on that, you do need to be careful in that. Obviously, increasing these is going to have a performance impact on your AppDynamics controller. So typically what I'll do is I'll just increase the 10-minute data retention so that if I need to go back the day after and look at what performance was like, I at least have a reasonable amount of resolution to look at there. All right. So another thing I'll do while doing performance testing is we'll make use of that baseline feature to create a baseline for a particular test. So if I've done some testing against a particular version, I can go in and I can create a baseline for that specific time period where I ran that test. And what that means is that when I run the next test, I can know straight away has performance deviated from the previous test. It's going to show me in terms of like health rules if I want. I can have it actually alert me. But it's also going to show on my dashboards, the colors are going to change if something's going wrong. So I can know straight away that I need to take a look and figure out what's actually going wrong there. Or likewise, if everything is green, if I don't get any alerts, then performance is going to be about the same. This is super useful to help you to understand very quickly, has performance changed or not? There's another tool, which actually that I was talking a bit about in the previous session. So there's a memory leak analysis tool. So even if you're not seeing specific symptoms of a memory leak, this is something you can do, particularly if you're a consultant like me, working with other customers to do performance testing, like as a value add type thing. You can make sure that even if it doesn't look like you're running out of memory, you can do this to kind of check to make sure that there are no actual memory leaks that are maybe only going to come out in production or something like that. So this is a really useful tool for you to add a bit of value there. So again, with synthetics. So when we're doing load testing, typically the tools we use are going to test at a protocol level. So typically, we're not actually loading the browser, we're not actually loading the mobile app, we're actually just be sending the HTTP calls or the API calls, opening a socket and sending them directly to the server. So what that means is that the results that we get in our test tool aren't going to necessarily indicate the full customer experience. They aren't going to tell you what the actual total page rendering time was, how long it took to get each of the resources. And so something we can do with AppDynamics is use the end-user monitoring tools, and particularly that synthetics tool, to actually get an understanding of that. So we can see, while the system is under load, what the actual user experience is like. How long did it take to load that page? How long did all the JavaScript take to run? How long did it take to render? So that's actually very useful. So you can say, well, yes, the system coped with load, and this is what the user experience is actually going to be like. It's going to take X number of seconds for that user to load that page. And in fact, you can also do that from multiple different locations. So if you want to understand from different parts of the world how your application is going to perform, you can use synthetics to do that. They have robots around the world. All right. And for those of you who are using AppDynamics in production, the final thing that's been very helpful for me is that we can actually use that to inform our workload model in our testing environments. So we can know what are all the business transactions that are very popular, that are very important to us, what are all the critical ones that we really need to focus on, and really how much of them do we need to do. It can often be a challenge when doing load testing, and any kind of testing really is which are the most important transactions and how many of them do we need to do. So if you're using AppDynamics in production, of course, you've got all those stats in real time. And like I said, usually for the past year, you can see what the workload's been like, and you can match that in your load testing, in your test environments. All right, so that brings me to the end of all of the tech tips and things. So hopefully I haven't overwhelmed you to there. I see a few nods and not too many eyes glazed over. I do apologize. It's probably a little bit early in the morning for Vegas. So let's just recap a few of the key points there briefly. Like I mentioned, if you do want to go over these things again, please do come up and talk to me afterwards. Otherwise, it's being recorded. You can have a look again later. So the main point that I really want to drive home is that we really want to use AppDynamics as early as we possibly can. We really want to understand sooner rather than later what our customers' experience is like, are there bottlenecks, are there issues, and fix them earlier on. There's a whole bunch of tips I've given you as to how you can integrate with your various test tools, things you can do to get more out of AppDynamics. Like I've mentioned, there's a whole bunch of built-in tools and things that make this really easy for you. Things like the microservices license, the non-production licenses. It might seem simple to you, but for me as a consultant that works with AppDynamics, the universal agent that they announced yesterday, it's actually going to be really, really, really great. They were literally putting an agent in there and having the whole thing up and running that you saw on stage literally within seconds. Like that's pretty amazing. So it makes it really easy. And of course, a key thing here is that we're going to have one platform across all of our environments. So we're going to have the same platform in production that your users are going to, your testers and your developers are going to be using across non-production and your test environments. So all of them are going to know how to use AppDynamics, how to get down into those deep details, and it's going to make your life a lot better. And just finally, just to recap those goals. So know and tune your customer experience sooner. Do it before production, because that's where it's easiest for you to fix it. Make sure you're getting continual feedback for your designers, for your developers, as they're going on, as they're writing your code. Yep. And like I said, make sure you're getting the most out of the APM. It's pretty revolutionary, this stuff, right? Like, the AppDynamics is pretty awesome compared to what we had just a few years ago. So make sure you're getting the most out of that. Use it as much as you possibly can and get the most value out of it that you can. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you very much. There will be a microphone. There you go. Thanks, Ryan. So questions? We've got one right here.
Hi, we currently do performance testing right now, and we use the baseline functionality to compare baselines like you were talking about.
Yeah.
And we want to move to where we're doing continuous integration, and we have automated performance tests that kick off, and preferably get to a point where we've even got automated comparisons so we don't have to go through manually and compare the baselines. Do you have any experience in that area?
So the experience I do have is in using the APIs to pull out those kind of metrics. You still have to write something at the moment to do that. The one thing I would suggest that you can look at is using health rules. So people tend to talk about health rules in terms of production, understanding if we've got something going wrong, someone needs to be alerted. But we can actually use those in non-production as well. So if you've got baseline set up, if you've set a particular baseline for a particular period, or if it's a rolling one, then you can use health rules to say, if performance is deviated from that, please tell me straight away so we can look at it. So that's something I'd suggest you look into there. Is that a reasonable answer for you?
Yeah, and I mean we're looking at a lot of different things like the health of the servers, obviously the response times, but also any deviation in the transaction volumes, because sometimes a developer will slip in something, and next thing you know, one tier is getting 100% more calls than it used to, things like that. So just looking at doing those types of comparisons across the board. Right.
So just to expand on that, with health rules, you can create a health rule based on any single metric in the system. I mean, yes, you can do it on performance and errors, but you can also do it on load. So if you had a baseline of, well, this is how much load we store against each node or each tier or each transaction, you can create a health rule that says, if that load changes, then please tell me, right? So any single metric in the system, you can create a health rule based on. It's not just performance, not just errors, it's not just degradation. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
We got one just here.
AppDynamics broke a very cardinal rules of development, that is to test in production.
Right.
Because you instrument that in dev and test unless you have very good load script to load it up. You don't see nothing until you see in production where everything lit up. So I just want your opinion. The way we've done so far was, first we encourage our customer to load it up in production, and then we pick the low-hanging fruits, and then we watch in production that help us inform the kind of load test, the model, all the things we pull back and then do release to fix things we see.
Okay, so let's see if I understood correctly. So you wanting to know my opinion on...
That's how we
right.
We don't have expert like you to, methodically taking people through. So
right.
we do guerrilla tactic.
Right, okay. So, I mean, that is a challenge of load testing. We can't necessarily always reproduce all the things that we're doing in production, which is, of course, why AppDynamics is so important, because it's going to see everything, right? So I guess my feedback there would be, given that we can see all the areas that are either really critical to us or are very popular to us, that really helps me to inform what we need to be testing in our load test environment. So your business people might have one view on what the things that are really critical to them, and that's obviously important. However, with AppDynamics, we can actually see the things that users are actually doing, and we can also see the areas that are quite problematic. So there's some area that's actually maybe caused us some problems, caused us some grief in the past, and that gives us that feedback to say, okay, we really need to make sure we test that and monitor AppDynamics in the test environment to make sure that's working well. Is that reasonable opinion?
You sort of agree with me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Got anyone else with a question?
So when you're talking about the headers and marking them up so that AppD would create a transaction, is there something similar to that for the Java side where I don't necessarily have an HTML page kicking off a transaction?
Sure, yeah. So as far as naming business transactions or getting data collectors and snapshots, you can do that either if it's HTTP, you can create headers, cookies, and parameters from there. But if it's just like custom code or arbitrary Java or C or any other code, you can pull data out of your code. So basically, I didn't go into it here, but you can configure it to say, here is the class and method where there's some parameter that I need to pull out. And as long as that method is executed in the path of your business transaction, then absolutely you can pull out a parameter. So say if you've got a string saying, do job XYZ, and you've got a parameter that says the job name, then perhaps you would put a data collector there that says, okay, every time that method is executed, intercept that and grab that job name out of there, and then you can use that in your business transaction names. Or indeed, you can use it in the data collectors so that when you're looking at snapshots, that kind of information is shown in the snapshots. So actually, I didn't actually talk about that, but that's actually really important as well, configuring data collectors in AppDynamics, because that means you can capture data like that. If you've got like a product ID or a customer ID or some piece of information that's going to help your developers diagnose what's actually going on, then absolutely you want to do that, and we can pull that out either from an HTTP request or from in your code. Any arbitrary method you can pull a parameter out of, as long as that method is executed somewhere in that business transaction.
But it sounded like when you were talking about it, you would actually trigger AppDynamics to force a transaction snapshot, which doesn't always happen. Right?
Sorry. So with the force snapshot one, no, that's. So the one that's AppDynamics snapshot enabled, that's just HTTP. You'd have to use development mode if you wanted to force snapshots to be triggered there.
Okay. And one more question.
Yeah.
If you have a business transaction that has wildly divergent timings, so some of them are really quick and some of them are really slow, and it causes the stall to occur.
Right.
How do you go about doing that when the stall is not actually a stall? It's doing what it's supposed to do. It's just got a lot more work to do.
Right. Okay. So in a performance test environment, something that I will typically do, I didn't cover it today, but so those thresholds for the stalls, for slow transactions and very slow transactions can be edited. right? So usually in a performance test environment, or any test environment really, most of the time you don't have any load, right? And so the default baselines aren't going to be very useful. And so those stall thresholds, so the slow calls, the very slow calls, and the stalls, are based on a 2-hour average within each agent. And so the first thing I'll do when I'm installing AppDynamics is change that threshold as low down as I can to 30 minutes. 30 minutes. And also the stall one, if I'm seeing that, then I'll increase that. The other key important thing there is that when I've seen that kind of thing happen, when I've seen a lot of change in transactions, a lot of time it's because there's actually multiple different transactions that have been captured in one business transaction. So an example of this is that there are some websites where when you load a page, it'll be the same URL that's loaded as to when you actually post to that page, right? And so out of the box, AppDynamics is going to group those together. So it's going to do both the get and the post in one business transaction. So you'll see there's a whole bunch of transactions that are like 20 milliseconds, and then you'll get some that are like 3 seconds. And so what you can actually do in the business transaction configuration is say, actually I want to split those out. So I want to say ones that are a post, that's one transaction, and things that are a get, that's a different transaction. Or perhaps there's something about the data, like if there's a parameter that's being passed in that request that determines what path of code is going to be executed, then I'll use that to split out so I can get more accurate timings for that. That's something I have seen quite a lot. But yeah, definitely adjust the thresholds for the stalls and such so you don't mark things incorrectly. Does that answer your question? Yeah, awesome, thanks. Yep, got one there. Got one down in front after that.
You mentioned the 1 minute granularity roll-up
Yep.
after a certain time. If you're running the test environment on the SAS controller,
Yep.
what kind of control do you have over that?
Right, yeah. Not a lot yourself. So you'd have to get in touch with AppDynamics support to be able to do that. And like I said, there are performance implications. So it kind of depends with SAS how big you are and whether you're on like one of the shared SAS environments or you've got a dedicated environment as to how willing they might be to do that, particularly with the 1 minute data, because the controller actually caches all the 1 minute data in memory. And so obviously, if you've got a lot of data, that can have quite a big performance impact. So that's typically why I go for more like the 10 minute data, because that's coming from the database. So yeah, thanks. Got one just down the front on the right here. How are we going for time? A few more minutes.
I shouldn't pick on Hamish since he works for me, but
thanks, boss.
one other thing you might want to point out maybe is we often tell clients is just because you want to use AppDynamics, say in dev and sit and SVP, say, is that the license is concurrent at the controller. So if you've got a single non-production controller, you don't have to necessarily have agent licenses for every environment. As long as they're switched off, you can kind of migrate them and leverage them and use them across all of those environments. So a lot of clients think they have to buy it for every environment, 3 or 4 non-prod every prod. But
not a very good salesman, this guy. He's doing himself out of license sales. But
we like to see
thank
clients
you,
get.
Stevie. That's my boss, by the way. So
We like to see clients get value out of their investment.
He is right though. So when it comes to licensing, and actually this is getting way better. Hopefully some of you saw in the keynote yesterday about the new license management tools. It's actually going to make it a lot easier for you to divvy out licenses across different applications or different teams. And those licenses are floating. So if you've got a bunch of servers spun up at one time, they can consume licenses. As soon as you turn those servers off, those licenses are freed up and available for someone else to use. So there is some flexibility in what you can do there if you need to test multiple different applications in terms of licenses. So thanks for that. We do have another few minutes. Right there.
Hey, when you look at your production data to determine what load to put on in your performance test, do you just eyeball the historical data, or is there a more rigorous way or preferably
I will typically
automatable way?
export it. I will typically export it. So in AppDynamics, there is a tool called the metric browser. And so that metric browser allows you to grab any single metric from anywhere in AppDynamics and put it on a graph. And what that also allows you to do is export that to a CSV or Excel file. So typically what I'll be doing is putting all of the business transactions and the volumes of them into the metric browser. And then I'll export that. And then if I need to do some more analysis, like of course, if you're looking at historic data, it's going to give you hourly figures. And so you might need to do some work to work out, okay, at what time of the day did all these different things occur, or what was the peak hour, what was the least busy hour. So usually I'll export that stuff into Excel or something and do a bit of work there. But yeah, certainly I'm not just eyeballing it, I am using the tools to export the data, do some analysis, and then come up with, this is what I propose as my workload model, validate that with the different teams I'm working with, and then go ahead with that. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Any follow-up?
I'm kind of curious, what's step 2 where you don't just export the data from AppDynamics, but you actually pull it into, in your case, JMeter. We use WebLoad.
Right.
Probably people use LoadRunner, but how does one pull that data into the tool, the performance testing tool?
Right. So it's going to depend on your tool. So typically, what I'll boil it down to is how many virtual users do I need to use, what the pacing is, so how many iterations per minute or hour I need to do, and the goal of the transaction. So with JMeter, if you really want to, you can write some custom timers to actually use that CSV file, which I have done before, but that's only if I'm doing something where I'm going to use that again and again and again. Whereas typically I'll just put in time and say, just look at my Excel spreadsheet and say, okay, I need 100 of these, I need 200 threads, and I need to do something X number of times per minute, and just plug that straight in there. Thank you. Yeah, just another couple of minutes, so I've got another question there.
Yeah, I had a question somewhat related to what you were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So do I understand it correctly that you could take data, you're capturing all these transactions that are either coming through production or some kind of a test environment,
Yep.
where you know every type of transaction is being produced by QA, and then you want to get those into a load testing environment.
Mm-hmm.
So is there an easy way to capture that information? I know there's an easy way to capture it, but to export it and then use it as test data in your
Right.
performance environment.
So let me see if I've understood you correctly. You meaning like if we're capturing like certain values and certain products and that kind of stuff? Or?
It's not like you're clicking a button. There's a request, in our case, there's a request being made,
Yeah.
and there's specific information that's being submitted. And in order for us to test it properly, we have
Right.
to have that information submitted.
Right. So with the APM products, not very easily. Maybe if you're technical enough, you could probably pull some of that out of the controller database, but not really recommended there. Certainly with the analytics product, so transaction analytics and log analytics, then absolutely. So that's kind of the kind of thing it's designed for, right? Like we want to capture things like email addresses and product IDs and customer IDs across all of our transactions.
Right.
And so absolutely with the analytics tool, you can get a list of every single product that was executed, and that can then go back into your test environment and say, okay, across our load test or across our QA test, what are we doing? We can use those product IDs to make sure we're testing the same things that's happening in production. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Apologies, it's now called Business IQ. Any more questions? We do have about 1 minute more.
Probably one more question if we have one. All right. If
All right.
not,
Well, thank you, everyone. I think if you're up for a prize, there's a survey you can do. Please, please do if you can. And thank you very much. Thank you for the great questions as well.